People are still trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'll read the bio. Um, Welcome, everyone. Very grateful that you're here today. We've got an impressive audience in attendance with state agencies from across the U.S. with an emphasis on departments of health and human services and social services. We're going to be talking about rulemaking, which is everyone's favorite topic. My name is Malika. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Esper. Esper is a regulation and policy management software platform that I started in 2018. Our mission is to help governments focus on policy, not paperwork, and really have an end-to-end solution for the policymaking process. Today, we are fortunate to work with dozens of government agencies across the U.S. to support their important policy work. Our customers range from the Washington State Department of Health to the Tennessee Department of Human Services. A fun fact about the Department of Human Services in Tennessee is that they were one of the very first agencies that we worked with back in 2018. And so I'm especially grateful and delighted to be joined by Becca, who is the Deputy General Counsel at the agency. To give you a little bit of an idea of how the format's going to roll today, I'm going to formally read Becca's very impressive bio. We're going to have a conversation about how the rulemaking process works, the Department of Human Services in Tennessee, steps they've taken to modernize, how they're tackling regulatory review that's required by the state legislature. And then we'll also have time for audience Q&A at the end. I think we're also going to get into a little bit more of Esper's product today. Becca's going to share some of her favorite product features, so it should be a good conversation. I will also note that this webinar is being recorded, and we're going to circulate it afterwards in case you'd like to forward it to anyone that wasn't able to make it, or you just want to rewatch it. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, Becca Parkhurst currently serves as the Deputy General Counsel for the Department of Human Services in Tennessee. She's held this position since January of 2016, where she provides legal advice to all department program areas and supervises a team of trial lawyers and legal assistants from across the state. She coordinates litigation strategy in cases statewide, and also litigates high-profile or complicated matters herself. She serves as the project manager for legal case management, the liaison to program staff to ensure satisfaction with legal services provided by the Office of General Counsel. She leads the department's rulemaking and retrospective rules review process and coordinated response to federal litigation matters with the Attorney General's office. Speaking of the Attorney General's office, prior to working at the Tennessee Department of Human Services, Becca was at the AG's office in Tennessee for a little over 8 years, serving as the Assistant Attorney General and later as Senior Counsel. So she's a very busy job. And Becca, I'm so grateful that you're taking a bit of time out of your day to talk with us and talk with everyone in the audience about Esper. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Of course. So I know I just read your bio, but maybe in your own words, can you talk about what your day-to-day looks like, how the Office of General Counsel at the Department of Human Services sort of like plays a hand in, I guess, has a hand in all the different pies of the program areas in the agency?
Sure, absolutely. So it's basically, in-house counsel type work for the most part, but with litigation, which does not always come hand in hand with being in-house counsel. To me, it's a really interesting role, and no 2 days are ever the same. This week, I'm actually working on a ton of rulemaking stuff, funnily enough, because this webinar fell right in the middle of that. I'm working on finalizing a retrospective rules review report that we have coming up due in the next couple of weeks to our governor's office, and working on some childcare rulemaking, some initial rulemaking in that area. But we basically give legal advice to all the program areas, and then I supervise a team of litigation attorneys who handle any of the litigation that comes in, whether it be with childcare or adult protective services or a family assistance area. And for the rest of the programs, a lot of what they need is, policy advice or just legal advice in general on issues that might be pertinent to their areas. We have a ton of programs that I'm still learning even 7 years plus later into this role, at about 4,000 employees statewide that we have to deal with disciplinary and other HR matters on as well.
Awesome. So full plate for sure. I know that you're at the AG's office before this. I'm curious if you had any exposure to rulemaking at the AG's office And if you did, what did that translate over to working in the executive branch with Tennessee Human Services? And if you didn't, what was the onboarding curve like for you?
Yes, they actually did. So our Attorney General's office in Tennessee reviews all rulemakings after the rulemaking hearing when you are getting ready to refile them as final rules. So in my role at the Attorney General's office, I would review various rules for the Department of Human Services, was one of my clients, among others, as they would come in for that final review before Attorney General sign off. That review is insanely detailed, and we mainly review them for constitutional analysis to ensure that they met all due process requirements and lined up with all of the right statutes and regulations that were pertinent to those rules. And so I didn't see any of the front end rulemaking, but got them kind of at the back end of that whole process for a final review.
It's helpful because we work with a lot of agencies that have a similar sort of, I guess, oversight mechanism where, you know, the agency will promulgate regulations, but then it needs to go to someone in the governor's office. Sometimes it'll need to go to like a joint committee on administrative rules in the legislature, and then oftentimes the AG's office. And I think that, you know, without exposure to the front end of all that rulemaking, you kind of ship it off to the AG's office and you're like, all right, well, hopefully we'll get it back in 3 months, I think is like kind of the joke that we hear among people. But it sounds like it's more around constitutional analysis and, you know, really thorough vetting of those rulemakings. That's what goes on at the AG's office.
Yes, absolutely. It is very detailed. I had a legal assistant there who I was really sad when she left because she was known as the expert on those reviews, and I would give everything to her first. And she would catch every single comma that was misplaced or, you know, typographical errors, anything like that, she would catch. And then I could focus on just the constitutional review.
Mhm.
And we were really sad when she retired because she was such an expert at it.
Yeah, it's like institutional knowledge. It comes in handy.
Yeah.
So I mentioned earlier, Tennessee Human Services was one of Esper's very first customers, the state of Tennessee. And now, for context, we are now statewide across all of the executive branch agencies in Tennessee. Back in 2019, I remember sitting with you in a room, I think maybe you were expecting at the time, and you're like,
Yes.
I'm going on maternity leave, but when I come back, this is going to be awesome. And we were like, Becca's cool. And in 2019, and you were giving us all this information about the rulemaking process at the agency and how sort of like paper, email based it was at the time. Can you share a little bit about what rulemaking looked like pre-Esper at Human Services?
Absolutely. So it was very manual, a very manual process between program and legal. There was a lot of back and forth over emails. We had a lot of version control issues, right? So if you had too many people trying to work on something at the same time, versions would get lost, and you would try to figure out in between all of those what was the last version that has the most recent updates on it that we can start back from again. And it was very difficult, especially the handoffs too. So all the handoffs were manual. So in our agency in particular, we will work with program staff to implement whatever rule revisions they want to have implemented. Then I pass those on to our general counsel for another second legal review post, my review. And then they have to go through another approval chain through like an assistant commissioner and then ultimately up to our commissioner before we pass those on to the governor's office for a final review. And all of those handoffs were on paper and carried desk to desk at the time or through inter-office mail, as was the attorney general's office review. And so one of the most frustrating pieces for me in the old system was we would get to the very end, we would have all the rulemaking hearings and our final rules, and they would have to be signed, wet ink signed in front of a notary by our assistant commissioner or our commissioner's office. So if you sent them to the attorney general's office and the signature page for the attorney general is on the same page as the commissioner's page, and something needed to be modified, they would call you and you would have to make those changes and send it back over, get your commissioner to re-sign. And so sometimes I was having commissioner sign 2 or 3 times, and it was frustrating because I felt like it also made legal look like we hadn't caught something. If the AG's office caught something later and we were having to have them re-sign multiple times on the same document. But it was very manual in nature, and we would deliver like in inter-office mail envelopes, the notarized copies over to the AG's office. They would then inter-office mail them back to us, and we would have to carry them to the Secretary of State's office to file the original hard ink, like wet ink signature copy.
So you were getting your 10,000 steps is what I'm hearing.
So many steps all over downtown.
No, but in all seriousness, this is something that we hear all the time. We're actually in Topeka, Kansas right now, where we're going to be presenting state agencies here tomorrow. And similar process, paper-based, taking folders back and forth. Sorry if anyone in Kansas is here, don't mean to put you on blast, but I think that, it's hard because you're struggling with version control. You also want to make sure these documents are secure because oftentimes they contain very important information that maybe isn't ready to be public. And until very recently, there hasn't been a good solution to manage all of it. What was your reaction when, these crazy 20-something-year-olds came into your office back in 2019 and said, we have a technology that we think can help with your rulemaking process? Were you unsure?
I was definitely a little unsure and a little bit like, is it actually going to work?
Yeah.
Because our rules are so specific on the formatting, like literally down to the spacing, and indentation of like what has to be indented 0.175 versus 0.375. The font is very specific and kind of all of the formatting changes were so specific. And the Secretary of State's office hated track changes. You couldn't use track changes, but they had to be in red line form. And so I was nervous about honestly whether like Esper could do the things we needed it to do in a format that the Secretary of State's office and the AG's office would accept.
Yeah.
But I was also, excited because it was such a tedious process. I remember one of the first sets of rule revisions I worked on in our office. I gave them to our subject matter expert before I knew what I was doing in rules, Nick Brindle, and he was like, "Oh, these are okay. They only took me a week to clean up, formatting wise, and fix all
Yeah.
the things that I had not done right." And the next that I gave him, it only took him a day, and so he was like, "Okay, you're learning." But now Esper does all of that stuff for me, and I don't have to worry so much about all of those things.
That was one of the most shocking parts. Like before, like formally starting Esper, we did a ton of research talking to like the EPA and the federal government, all the way down to like truly local county health departments, asking, how do you make policy? What types of policy do you make? Rulemakings, guidance documents, things like that. And then sort of like tried to dig in on the pain points, figuring out if like there's something here that we can truly solve. Because we had a hunch, we wanted to verify it. And the formatting came up so often. Or like we have a very specific format that the Secretary of State or the Office of Legal Services requires. And we honestly spend hours on that every single week instead of actually like the policy. And we were like, okay, well, that's definitely a very specific problem that Esper can solve. We'll set you up with a template so that you're good to go from the start and don't have to worry about like document margins or, a misplaced italics, for example. So I understand if I were in your shoes, I'd probably also be a little skeptical. um, so I guess I'll be talking a little bit more about the types of rulemakings you work on right now. DHS has like a pretty large purview. Like you said, you have a lot of program areas. What are some of the subject areas that Human Services most frequently conducts rulemaking on? I think this question is interesting, by the way, because we have a lot of sort of like parallel agencies in other states to yours in attendance that might be interesting for to tease out. And then second part to that question is, are most of these rulemakings that you're working on prompted by legislation or by public input? What does that division look like?
Sure. So we do a lot of rule amendments around childcare regulations. Specifically, usually at least once every couple of years, there's something new that has changed as far as what the appropriate standard of care is, or developmental guidelines, for example, changes in safe sleep procedures, because these are rules, that apply to all the licensed childcare agencies in our state. So I'm working on some rules for those right now. We're in initial drafting stages, and we just amended these rules a couple of years ago in a pretty massive overhaul. We review, pursuant to federal and state requirements, child support guidelines once every 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we are typically in the middle of conducting either a review or amending our child support guidelines as those reviews come up every few years. And those also involve an economic expert that we have to hire every few years to weigh in on the appropriate amounts in the worksheets and any kind of factors that might impact those. So those are a couple of areas, but honestly, we do rulemaking across the board. We have rehabilitation services rules that are ongoing right now. adult protective services rules that we need to make amendments to pursuant to legislation that was passed last year that went into effect, changing some definitions in that arena and giving us some more leeway to put on the abuse registry, for example, people who have financially abused someone else, as opposed to cases just involving governmental funds, which was the standard that we had in place before. But we really do rulemaking across all of our different programs, and it depends on the program area where it stems from. Childcare has a lot of, or all of our programs really have a lot of federal input from both federal partners and federal rules that might be, changed or modified, because we have a ton of programs that receive federal funding and have federal guidelines attached to them in addition to the state statutory guidelines. And so we have to look at both of those things in determining whether rulemaking is necessary or amendments are needed. In some areas, we get more input than others. In childcare, for example, we have a statutorily required licensing standards board that has to review all rule revisions prior to the actual formal rule revision process taking place. For child support, we have an appointed committee that also reviews that is comprised of child support judges, magistrates, and practitioners that actually help us with those rule revisions. And in some other areas, we just we're working on the rules on our own. But in a lot of times we do seek stakeholder input in the beginning under a non-formal process, even if it's not required, just to ensure that things are kind of smoother on the back end during that GovOps review and procedure. Our legislature is very interested in hearing how much public input the department received, how much we sought out, and did we make any changes in response to any of that public comment or input on those particular rulemakings.
Amazing. I mean, it sounds like a lot. I didn't realize that you were required to have an economist review. Is there like a specific service that state agencies use, or do you just have like a job posting and people apply for it for a contractor?
We actually have employed the same contractor as long as I've been with the department for the review every year. And she's very well known sort of nationally, and almost all of the states use her for that review. But we are required to hire an economist. It's not specified like what company or who, but until she retires, we're probably going to keep using Jane.
Yeah, so it's like a third party sort of economist that comes in and does like an independent audit.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. I didn't know that. I wonder if other state agencies have a similar requirement, or if this is unique to childcare.
I believe it is national across the board for child support that you have to have an economist weighing in on those like income share guidelines, and kind of, giving input into the minimum and maximum amounts of support that can be ordered at different economic levels.
Huh. Interesting. Didn't know. When it comes to tracking federal statute, how do you do that today? I know SBIR has tools in there. Do you use that in combination to other things? What does the research process look like when you're sort of building your rulemaking package?
I mean, a lot of times we're honestly going through and checking in SBIR, like if anything's noted at the bottom in the authority citations as being, sort of, on a, like whether it's being amended at the time or has been amended in the past, because it will flag those citations for you if they have been modified. But we honestly do a lot of outside just searching as well. Like, for example, there are some pending APS rules that are currently pending at the federal level, and they're the first ever federal adult protective services rules. They've never pushed for these before. So we also just keep in good contact with our different federal partners when they have proposed rules and regulations that are circulating out there. And all of our program SMEs keep their eyes on the ground. Honestly, the program SMEs probably have better, read on that and kind of alert us within legal sometimes before we even know that something might be coming down the pipe.
Yeah. I'm gonna share my screen so people can understand what we're talking about. Hopefully everyone can see this and ignore my messy background. But whenever you're in SBIR, you're actually able to search across federal and state laws and regulations. We have all 48 states except for like Nebraska and Hawaii, and then federal statute as well. And we've built sort of like this ontology where you're able to look at your regulations. This is a maternal and child healthcare regulation in Kentucky, and cross-reference it against state statute and also federal statute where applicable. And if a state law has been repealed or been updated more recently than this rule, we flag it for you and say, hey, this might be something that you want to check out. whether it's for regulatory review or to make sure that you don't go awry of any federal or state standards that are set by the legislature. So this is what Becca is referencing here. And we have this for basically every state in the country, and you're able to see, you know, what percentage of your regulations cite repealed laws, or you can even sign up for alerts on statutes that you know will impact your agency, and you'll be notified when they're changing. So you can, you know, track all the associated rulemakings with it. So just for context, that's what this looks like inside of Esper. We've gotten feedback that we need to share more of our product in the demo, so I'm trying to weave it in here.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about sort of the scope and the breadth of your rulemaking. You mentioned that, you know, there are a lot of stakeholders involved in the process, like external stakeholders to the agency, whether it's partners to the agency or like concerned citizens, but even internally with the program areas, you've got to collect and organize a lot of, you know, stakeholder feedback. What did that look like pre-Esper and then post-Esper's implementation?
Sure. So pre-Esper, you know, was a lot of just back and forth on email from program going, hey, we need to take a look at this, you know, provision. We think it needs to be amended, and then a lot of meetings to talk through it, right? And just sitting down and kind of hashing it out. Honestly, we haven't used Esper to its full capability for gathering that stakeholder feedback yet. The one thing we have done is we have program individuals in every area that now have access to Esper, and they can go in and sort of make initial, you know, drafts or in redline format to the actual regulations themselves in, you know, versions, and they can get in the system with us to look at those and kind of do that back and forth. My goal is moving forward to get them even more involved, you know what I mean, within the software system itself, because they're so used to the old way that they still want to just email us, hey, we need to look at this revision. I'm actually dealing with that right now in our childcare rules. Does anybody have a comprehensive list of all the revisions that you need to be made?
Yeah.
And putting those, you know, and making sure we get them in the system. And then using Esper to download those red lines to get stakeholder feedback from those external groups is what we've been using it for.
Mm-hmm.
So what I typically do is we will do the drafts in Esper, and prior to having those stakeholder meetings, what we'll do is we'll identify what we think needs to be changed, you know, and kind of redline it out, watermark everything as a draft after we download it, and then pull stakeholder meetings together, show those on the screen, and kind of walk through those with those external stakeholders and have them give us feedback on other areas they think that need to be revised, or feedback on the revisions that we're already going to complete and whether they agree or not agree with those.
Got it. I mean, how long does it take end to end, you know, to do one rulemaking? Year?
I mean, 8 to 9 months is probably a pretty good gauge. So I have an example of an old timeline that we kind of put together.
Mm-hmm.
I can share on my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, it might be a little small too. So let me see if I can at least zoom in a little bit on my end. So this is something we created in-house to kind of guide us when program was asking, you know, how long does a rule revision take? Because I don't think they realized all the steps. And other states may have some, you know, variances to this kind of timeline. But we, you know, kind of built out this Excel chart, which, you know, talks about how long it takes to draft, and then each of the various pieces, you know, from commissioner review, governor's office review, how long after you file it you have to hold those public hearings. In Tennessee, it's 52 days because it takes 7 days to be effective, and then another 45 days for that hearing notice period. How long we keep written comments open afterwards, giving yourself time on the back end to draft that final one. Then there's a second governor's office review at the back end, and then the attorney general's review. And then you finally file it with the Secretary of State's office, and they're not effective until 90 days later. Yeah. And during that 90 days, you have your GovOps committee hearing, and you talk with them about that. When we created this, we had created it on our own, and we actually talked to Esper at one point and said, hey, it'd be really cool if we could plug in the date by which we want our rules to be effective, and you build sort of backwards deadlines for us based upon that, so that we know when we need to initiate those rulemakings and like what's our drop dead date for starting those. And Esper actually took that feedback and created that feature within the system, and it actually has these exact duration deadlines built in for us in Tennessee, specifically in human services. Other agencies may have, you know, tweaked theirs or have a different route, but they actually built that in the system, and it's so fantastic because now we just use the system to do that. And I can plug something into the system and say, hey, Esper, I want rules effective by, January 1st of 2025. When would I need to start that? And so I've got some right now in the system that we're working on that have timelines on those. I can share that as well. So what it looks like on my end in the system right now, so currently working on these DRS rules, or community rehab provider rules. They're in legal review right now. But as you can see, and this was like an older one that didn't go forward quite when we thought it would, but it has all of the due dates sort of built out for if we wanted it to have been effective by a certain date, you know what I mean? These are all the deadlines we would have need to have met to make that happen. And so it's really helpful, I think, when you're looking at rules, because I don't think a lot of program contacts necessarily understand how much goes into it. Now, some of it still outside of your control, right? You hope governor's office review will take 2 weeks. It might not, depending on whether session's in, or what they have going on. But these are kind of the main timelines under which all these rulemakings happen. And then there's another feature, I kind of love this. And you may already be planning to talk about this, but this piece here.
No, I'm like, I'm like, go for it. Share the screen.
I kind of love this piece here. If you can, let me finish hitting share and you might be able to see it. Where I can look at the timeline of all of my currently pending rulemakings, like what percentage of progress has been made on them, kind of where they are in the process, and then when we might anticipate them actually becoming effective based on where they are today. And so that's just easy to look at in a glance. If you need to pull a report or share with, someone in your leadership team to say, here are all of the rulemakings we have going on, and here is where they stand. And we've used that quite a bit. And I don't know if you want to talk about the retro review, because I don't know if every state has that requirement. But we're also now using it for our what we call retrospective reviews that are required by statute, where we're reviewing every rule of the department every 8 years, I believe, and making decisions on each and every one of those rules as to whether we need to keep them as is, repeal or amend, decision notes about all of those various things.
Man, you just covered so much of the product. I love it. Well, let's come back to retrospective review. The work backwards plan, by the way, is like beloved by like many customers of ours, not just in Tennessee, but in Texas and Washington State, California. And I didn't realize that you were the one that suggested it. I just remember our professional services director, Alden, coming to our products and engineering team and saying, this is going to be a game changer for the product. They want to have be able to set an effective date and then build a work backwards plan of all the steps that need to happen based on that. And it was a cool engineering product because it's all configurable. Your work backwards plan in Tennessee will not be the same as the work backwards plan in Arizona, right? And so we had to make this configurable layer where we can make it specific to your agency and make it flexible and have that for you and then something different for another agency. So it's a cool product feature. And I was surprised the other day when you told me that was actually, I shouldn't be surprised. And the Gantt chart that you just showed, similar deal, that was released, I think, later last year. It came out and people are really enjoying that. Not only can you see the progress of the different rules, but you can also see who is working on what in your agency. So if you're trying to manage team workload, you can also do that in Esper too. Let's talk about retrospective review. I think actually most states have some version of a regulatory review. In some states, it's very enforced. We have to review our regulations every 4 years. Otherwise, the legislature is going to cut our funding and the agency will collapse. It's very catastrophic. And then in other states, I think it's more relaxed, where agencies are oh, yeah, we need to do that. But where do we have the time or resources to do that in addition to truly everything else? So do you want to talk a little bit about Tennessee's requirement and then how you're tackling it?
Sure. So we have a requirement to have a report together. The first one is due December 1st, 2023. But the report is actually due to our governor's office for their input by October 1st of 2023, because they have an amazing amount of agencies and rule decisions to take a look at before those reports go through. So we actually just finished reviewing all of our rules. I set all of our rules the timeline's kind of backwards by a month to give us time internally to have internally built in like review time. And so I'm actually in the process right now of reviewing that final report a second time. I have reviewed it once already, and I'm on my second pass at it to make sure that we haven't missed anything. And there's a really cool screen that was released, and this was again after like a suggestion that somebody made to us for like, it would be really cool if we could see this at the top where we could tell where everything is. And so you can actually expand this chart at the top and it'll tell you what stage each of these reviews are currently in. So if they're at the governor's office review, that means we have done our parts because we have to have that completed by October 1st, and we are there at 100%. And then if you've started a review, that would be denoted there. If you have an at-risk review, that would be denoted. If you've completed a review, and that would be post-governor's office review and sign-off, that would be noted on this chart, and then chapters that you haven't reviewed yet. And that has been really helpful. And then it will give you those rule decisions at a glance. I can take a look at this and see how many we have noted that we need to repeal or, reserve, or how many we need to amend, and how many are going to remain unchanged. As you can see, DHS has quite a few rules. So we'll be doing a lot of work after this project to tackle those rules that we've identified need to be amended or repealed. And so that's been a really helpful tool. And the report that it builds out is really fantastic as well. And I actually had one pulled up earlier because I'm going through our final report now, and it will include decision notes for the governor's office. I'm not sure if those go in that final report that go over to the legislature, or if it is just, kind of the regular report. But I can also show you, point that up now, what that looks like, because I downloaded this earlier because I was working on reviewing it again. So I have been, there it is, trying to find that window, sorry. So this is what that final report format looks like when it comes out of SBIR. So it automatically populates like the description and the chapter numbers, the review. Right here is where you make your decision, and it will populate whatever decision you pulled from like a drop-down box, whether that's amend, repeal, or remain unchanged. Then we have to answer this question for our legislature of whether it adheres to all current state and federal laws, court rulings, and other standards. It plops in the administrative history, and then it will include those decision notes about why it needs to be either amended or remain unchanged or kept as is. And our rules are so massive that this report is currently 296 pages long. And I'm taking a second pass at reviewing that before we pass that on to the governor's office here in a couple of weeks for them to take a look at that. But this tool has been amazingly helpful for that, because I would go in and see where we were on any rules that were at risk, that deadlines were passing we hadn't met yet, and be sure that I could bug those attorneys that were in charge of that. So what I did was we created a whole project team, and we started this about a year in advance. And we assigned out different areas to different subject matter experts within the Office of General Counsel. And then they were responsible for putting together meetings with the program staff to discuss the rules and the rules decisions, and then enter those decisions. And I'm going back and reviewing all of those kind of against, sort of guidelines and kind of what we think we want the decision notes to look like, making sure they're succinct, that there are no typos, and taking a look at those. But it was a massive project, and I think this software helped project manage it in a way that made it easy to see where everyone was at any given time, and whether we had anything to be concerned about with the upcoming deadlines.
Honestly, the report looks great. I think the like plopping in like the administrative histories and like the like citations is actually super useful, because that's just tedious to like go in and type all that out. And that's, the SBIR's product can be thought of in like 3 buckets. First is around workflow, and policy drafting would be the second, actually collaborating in the text editor, and the third is reporting out. But the foundation layer underneath all 3 of those things is the data layer of the rules, the laws of federal and state and your own agencies. And so that feeds into all the different parts of the product. If you're working on a new regulation, will help you find the right citations for it. Or if you're pulling a report and you want to know, does this conflict with what we're working on right now, we'll be able to show that for you based on the sort of ontology that we showed earlier. So it's a kind of like sneaky part of the product that I think helps in a bunch of different vectors.
Absolutely.
I know we are going to come up to audience Q&A here in a second, but I wanted to ask you, reflecting on the past 4 years, what was the experience of implementing Esper like at Human Services, and what advice would you give to other agencies thinking about making a change?
I think we probably, I mean, it was definitely a learning curve, but I don't think it was very difficult because the product is very intuitive. And I think that the help services are super easy to get a hold of. Like I can email in a question and it's responded to or, fixed, pretty quickly. Also, people are always willing to jump on a Teams call or a Zoom meeting and say, okay, let me take a look at that with you to see what's wrong. Because there have been some problems that how do my IT folks put it, are picnic problems, where they say problem in chair, not in computer. But Esper has been amazing about not calling those out when they meet with us. If it is an us problem, we just couldn't figure out how to do something, they just explain it again. Um, but I think that's been super helpful. I would say we held it probably a little too tight as far as who had access to the product at first. So we didn't utilize it to the full extent to which we could have, right? So we didn't actually allow program staff to get in there and make changes within the actual rules and regulations on a draft format at the very beginning, despite the fact that they have to be approved from legal, before they move forward. We kind of kept that control at the legal level. And I don't know if I would do that again from the outset, because now we're really kind of having to push program to try to use the software more, and be more involved in it because they're not used to that process. I will say that all of our folks on the approvals chain are super used to getting in there and looking at the rules and the rulemaking package. And probably something I didn't mention, which I think is fantastic, is that it creates some of those forms for you, whether it's the notice of rulemaking hearing or the red line, then just spits them out in Word, and you can just download them and move on if you need to send them outside the system. We've been lucky enough in Tennessee, though, that our Attorney General's office is now part of Esper. And so I just sent our first rulemaking to them for review actually in the system. And I'm super excited to get that back from them. So I'm really excited about that. And then, hopefully eventually Secretary of State's office might also get on board as well so that we can file them that way, because we are still doing that manually. But they have, they will accept, the forms that come out of Esper now, and they will accept the non-notarized signatures. So we have made progress on that front. But I would say the more people in your sort of chain of rulemaking approvals and reviews that you can get in the system earlier, the better, because it does really help with a lot of that back and forth and the manual tracking. I mean, I can look in here and I'm like, oh, that one was sent over to the governor's office on what date? I wonder if I should bug them about whether they've looked at that yet, or the Attorney General still has this one for review. If my, general counsel is like, hey, what's the status of this? I can look at it and give her an update in about 2 seconds.
Yeah.
As opposed to having to track people down and sort of manually seek out that information.
Which you don't have time for, given your
I do not.
description. Love it. Thank you so much. I know that we've got some folks probably that have some questions. I think you have a couple options. You can raise your hand and vocalize your question, or you can pop it into the chat at the bottom of the Zoom window. So either or. Feel free to ask away, anything for Rebecca or myself, happy to answer. Usually takes a few seconds.
Okay.
All right, Q&A. Great question, Brenda. Isn't there a policy side of Esper? If so, why did Tennessee not use it for their policies too? Okay, great question. Love this. So we launched Tennessee in 2019 with our rulemaking product. So for regulations. And we only launched our policy product like late last year, and it's going super well. A lot of agencies are using it now. I don't think we've actually pitched Tennessee on like adding it to their contract. So
yeah, and I would say the only reason was we actually had a different software system that our QISS, and that's our sort of policy program area, had put into place for our policy development. And I don't know how long their contract works, but you know what I mean, or runs, but I'm sure that, they may look at that in the future.
Yeah. I think we've talked to a few Tennessee agencies about it, but the contract renewal is just coming up. But originally, Tennessee was our first, sort of rulemaking regulatory customer. And now, like for some of the newer agencies that have joined ESPR, a lot of them end up sort of purchasing both regulation and policy. All right. Tamara, this is a question for you, Becca. How long did it take for your agency to fully transition into utilizing the new rulemaking system?
Probably, honestly, like 6 months or so. I mean, we definitely started, you know what I mean? It was sort of a slow roll into it, if that makes sense. And so we were using it in legal pretty quickly to create those forms and those notices. But what was happening is we'd be doing the same back and forth outside the system that we'd always done with program on developing what we wanted to change and then putting them in the end. And so we are still pushing to use it for all pieces of the process earlier rather than later, and that has been a transition. But I think, legal was fully using it at least, 6 months in to do all of our rulemaking.
Yeah, it goes back to the advice you gave, which is get more people involved early on, which I would say like is true, not only like in implementing the process, but also in considering whether or not you want to adopt a new software. We see like the most successful customer implementations have all of the stakeholders involved in sort of the decision-making process, seeing demos of the product before making a purchasing decision, so that everyone sort of knows what's coming and it's not a surprise. So I think that is super valuable as well.
Absolutely. Funny, I had a rulemaking hearing this morning, and you all probably know how these go. You kind of just have to sit there and wait for questions, and then you can't really respond to them, other than saying, thank you for your feedback. We'll take that back to leadership to discuss. And I sat for 30 minutes in silence on that call this morning all by myself. Like people joined it, I think, to just join, but they didn't really want to comment. And I was like, okay, I'll just gonna hang out.
Rulemaking here, this wasn't like a GovOps committee. This was like the
No
public comment. People are
yeah. I actually hosted one of those this morning. It was funny. I was like, I told my general counsel, I was like, I'm holding a rulemaking hearing this morning, and then I've got a rulemaking software webinar this afternoon.
You're busy. Okay, another question. Brenda asks, can it track all of the public comments from hearings and compile them? I don't think Tennessee has this functionality, but some of our other customers do. We can talk about it if you want to, Becca. But yes, you are able to upload feedback and store them alongside the rulemaking package. And it's on our product roadmap to actually build out more of a public comment solution in 2024. But right now you're able to upload, whether it's Word documents, written feedback from hearings, or audio, and store those alongside the rulemaking package so you can revisit them.
I think that'd definitely be a good feature if you're looking to add something in the future, because depending on the type of rulemaking we have, for childcare rules in particular, we have had comments in the 1,500 plus in the past. And that included written and oral comments that, we compiled and put together. So definitely something that would be amazing to be able to store in there beside the rules.
Yeah. One of the, our guiding North Star for how we think about our product process is based around what we call the policymaking life cycle. And we started this sort of early in building out ESPR. We realized that every state has a regulatory and policymaking process, but it's different across all states, the nuances. We needed to extract higher level themes from how agencies across different governments create policy. And so we sort of conceptualize this policymaking life cycle. I'm trying to find an example of this for y'all so you can take a look and see what I'm talking about. But basically, our goal from a product perspective is to own as much of the policymaking process as possible. And to do that, it includes, not only regulatory drafting and policy research and publication, but public comments. So we're slowly chipping away at this like 8-stage policymaking life cycle, and public comments is obviously part of that. Maybe like wait a few more seconds to see if any other questions pop in.
Sure.
If no other questions, we will have this video recorded and share it with you afterwards. It's also uploaded to YouTube on our Esper channel with, I think, a whopping 11 subscribers. So feel free to check it out there. If you have any questions or want to chat, I'll just pop my email in here. And you're welcome to send me a note, and can help answer anything you've got. Becca, thank you so much. You're a very busy lady. I appreciate your time today, and for, actually sharing your screen and showing what parts of the product you like. I'm sure that was really helpful for the audience.
Absolutely. Anytime.
All right. Have a lovely rest of your day. It's good to see you.
Thanks. You too. Take care.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.